The chains bite into my wrists as they drag me toward the longhouse, though tonight no blade waits at my throat. Instead, I face something far stranger. Did you know that Vikings often had sex for 3 hours straight? Imagine being a farmer's wife in the smoky dark, heart pounding, not from passion but from dread, because the man beside you would not stop until exhaustion claimed you both. She would sometimes fall sick the next day, knowing her body was not her own but the clan's, and yet no one questioned it. This was the rhythm of life, as ordinary as splitting wood or slaughtering a goat. This is Viking life, merciless, unflinching, and absolute. Stay with me and witness the truth behind it. The longhouse was no palace of privacy. It was a world of wood, smoke, and woven wool, where every sound, every sigh, every whispered breath carried beyond the fur blankets. The fire sat at the centre, its glow licking the beams above, the smoke curling through the rafters to the smoke holes cut in the roof. Around it, families lay side by side, children, thralls, warriors, and wives, each cloaked in their own bundles of wool. The night was thick with the scents of sweat, ash, and salted meat drying from the rafters. It was here, beneath these beams, that the mysteries of the body were played out before half-sleeping eyes. To live as a Viking meant surrendering the idea of solitude. We slept shoulder to shoulder, heads against the same earth, hearing each other breathe, cough, or cry out in the dark. And when a husband reached for his wife, or a man turned toward his concubine, the act was not hidden by walls or doors, for such things did not exist. Privacy was foreign. The bed was not a chamber, but a heap of straw and wool, set beside others, its sounds muffled only by the creak of timber and the roar of the hearth. In this closeness, sex was never only between two. It was a spectacle of silence, endured and overheard by all. Imagine the tension of it, the shift of blankets, the low groan, the rhythm of bodies pressed together, while cousins feigned sleep nearby. A child might stir, a thrall might cough, and yet the act continued, relentless, for intimacy was less about passion and more about duty. To falter, to hesitate, was to show weakness. A Viking man was expected to perform with the same endurance he brought to war, and the longhouse bore witness to whether he succeeded. Reputation was fragile, and a whisper in the morning could carve it apart. In this way, the longhouse itself became judge. Women knew their cries were measured, their silence interpreted, their obedience noted. Men knew that failure would not remain hidden, for nothing in the longhouse ever did. It was not only the fire that burned through the night, but the weight of collective scrutiny. The entire household, from kin to slave, carried the knowledge of who had satisfied, who had faltered, who had endured. Such openness might seem unthinkable now, but for the Norse it was survival. The longhouse was the heart of the clan, a fortress of timber where every life was bound together. The intimacy of two was swallowed by the community of many, and the line between private flesh and public reputation dissolved in the smoke. The body was not only yours, it was your family's, your kin's, your clan's. Every act echoed across bloodlines and law codes alike. This was Viking life, intimacy without secrecy, passion without privacy, every embrace entwined with reputation. The longhouse did not forgive, and it never forgot. What was whispered in the rafters at night lingered in the hall at dawn, shaping honour as surely as battle. The hearth had burned low, its embers glowing like the eyes of spirits beneath the ash when the ordeal began. There was no rush, no furtive grasp as in later ages where secrecy governed intimacy. Here in the longhouse, the act was not stolen, it was declared. A Viking man's worth was not in a fleeting moment, but in his endurance. Did you know it was said that 3 hours was a common span for the bedfurs to shake with the weight of flesh? Such a feat was not indulgence, but proof of virility, proof of power, proof that his seed carried strength enough to build a lineage that would outlast the timber beams. For the woman, these hours were no dream. They were endured, as the cold was endured, as childbirth was endured, because survival demanded it. She knew, as did her mother before her, that reputation was forged not only by the swords her husband swung in battle, but by the fire of his loins. If he faltered, whispers spread like frost through the household. If she refused, she threatened the honour of her kin. Thus the longhouse did not sleep. All heard the low sounds, the shifting bodies, the drawn-out rhythms, and in the morning all carried the knowledge of what had taken place. Endurance was everything. A warrior who could outlast hunger, storm, and enemy blade was expected also to outlast in the bed. For some, these hours were pride boasted of at the ale bench, retold in half-mocking verse. For others, it was torment, a night that dragged like a frozen march across snow. The sagas speak not of tenderness, but of strength tested through the flesh, as if the act itself was another raid, another battle to be conquered. 3 hours of fire and frostfire in the body, frost in the soul. For women, dread often began long before the first touch. Wives knew what was expected. They prepared as warriors prepared for war, bracing themselves for the test to come. Some looked away, their eyes on the fire. Others hardened their faces into stillness, a mask against the gaze of kin who might overhear. The body became both battlefield and tribute, demanded again and again, measured not by passion, but by duration. And yet, these hours were not only suffering. To endure was also to bind. A child might be conceived, a lineage secured. A husband might prove himself more than a whisper of weakness. And though exhaustion pressed upon both, the household gained the unspoken assurance that its bloodline would not falter. 3 hours was not merely flesh against flesh, it was duty to kin, to gods, to the land itself. The fire dimmed, the frost thickened outside, but the longhouse knew. When dawn came, smoke rising anew from the hearth, the man walked with pride or with shame, and the woman bore her silence as shield. The test was complete, until the next night, when again the fire would burn low, and the hours would stretch, merciless and absolute. The Viking world was bound together not only by swords and ships, but by whispers. Reputation was the shield that guarded every man and woman, and nowhere was that shield more fragile than in the bedfurs. Sex was not hidden in chambers of stone, locked away from prying ears. It unfolded in the open air of the longhouse, where silence was thin and nothing escaped notice. A man's reputation could rise or crumble in those hours of flesh, and a woman's honour could be carved apart by a single careless rumour. To falter in intimacy was no small matter. If a warrior struck poorly with his axe, he could redeem himself in the next raid. But if he was mocked for weakness in the sheets, that stain clung tighter than blood. The sagas recall insults sharper than any spear thrown across ale benches where laughter cut deeper than blades. To be called incapable, to be accused of failing to satisfy a wife, was to be stripped of manhood itself. Such words could start feuds, provoke duels, or drive men to desperate violence, for they threatened not only the individual, but the honour of the entire household. Women, too, bore the weight of judgment. A sigh too loud, a glance too bold, or a whispered suspicion could mark her as unchaste. Once spoken, such words spread faster than fire on a thatched roof. Her family's alliances could fracture, her children's inheritance cast into doubt. Virginity guarded before marriage, fidelity demanded, after these were the threads that bound her reputation. And if she was accused of straying, even falsely, her kin might pay the price in silver, blood, or both. The community itself became the judge. In the morning, when the smoke rose from the hearth and the household gathered for bread and broth, eyes slid sideways, listening, remembering. Who had stirred in the night? Who had faltered? Who had endured? Reputation was not private, it was a public ledger written in silence and knowing looks. Each person's standing was weighed daily, not only by deeds in war or trade, but by whispers of the night before. This reputation reached beyond the household. At the Althing, where disputes were settled, accusations of adultery or impotence were heard alongside cases of theft and land. To be publicly shamed for matters of the bed was to be marked for life. Men challenged one another to duels over words, and women defended their honour with testimony, calling on kin to witness their truth. The body itself was put on trial, its acts judged as part of law and order. Thus, intimacy was never private indulgence, but a public performance. Every touch was shadowed by consequence, every union weighed by the eyes of kin, thralls, and neighbours. To be careless was to risk ruin. To endure was to safeguard not only the self, but the bloodline, the clan, the very fabric of honour. In the Viking world, reputation in the sheets was as vital as valour on the battlefield. One earned through endurance, the other through steel, but both bound by the same truth. Without honour, you did not survive. In the Viking world, a woman's body was never entirely her own. It was a vessel of lineage, a guarded treasure upon which the honour of families rested. Her chastity before marriage, her fidelity after, her fertility throughout these were not private matters, but the foundation upon which entire households were built. To betray them was to threaten inheritance, to invite scandal, to fracture kin bonds as surely as a broken sword. In her flesh, the fate of clans was written. From the moment of birth, her value was measured in whispers of future alliance. Fathers guarded their daughters as they guarded their fields, knowing that her virginity was wealth, a currency that could bind families or bring shame. When she entered marriage, she carried not just her dowry of cloth, livestock, or silver, but the unspoken assurance of her untouched body. On the wedding night, the union was not simply between bride and groom. It was between two families, two lineages, their reputations interwoven in her blood. Once married, the burden grew heavier. Fidelity was demanded, and not only by her husband. Kin watched closely, neighbours judged, and the law itself held her to account. If she strayed, it was not only she who bore the shame, but every man of her household. Inheritance could be challenged, children deemed illegitimate, alliances shattered. A single accusation of infidelity could undo years of careful marriage-making, setting feud against feud until blood was spilled to cleanse the dishonour. And yet, within this cage of expectation, women wielded power. They chose when to grant their silence and when to speak. They could accuse a man of abuse, seek divorce, or influence the household from the shadows. A wife's counsel was valued, and her management of keys and stores gave her authority that stretched beyond the bed. But always, her sexuality remained tied to the fragile thread of honour. Her strength lay not in freedom, but in strategy, how to survive, how to endure, how to bend expectation without breaking it. The sagas tell of women who used this power with cunning, a whispered refusal, a public accusation, a carefully timed acceptance of a lover all carried weight. Yet these were dangerous gambits. To be exposed was to risk ruin. To be discreet was to hold influence. A woman's honour was not only a shield for her kin, but a weapon she could wield if she dared. In truth, her body was battlefield and blessing alike. Through childbirth, she secured the line. Through fidelity, she protected inheritance. Through silence, she safeguarded her family's name. And though she bore the heaviest burden, she also stood as the pillar upon which the clan rested. The vessel of honour, both captive and cornerstone, her life revealed the raw truth of Viking survival. That sexuality was never merely personal, it was destiny. In every sigh and silence, in every whispered rumour, the fate of families was decided. A woman was not only herself, she was the honour of many, carried in her body, bound by law, and etched into memory like runes upon stone. The Vikings did not separate flesh from law. What unfolded beneath woolen blankets could be judged in the open air of the Althing, the great gathering where disputes were heard and justice spoken aloud before gods and men. The same assembly that ruled on stolen cattle or slain warriors also weighed the hidden acts of the bed. For in this world, sex was not a private indulgence, it was a matter of honor, inheritance, and survival. Adultery was not just betrayal of the heart, it was theft of bloodlines, theft of certainty in who would inherit land and wealth. If a man was caught in another's bed, the penalty could be silver fines, or, if honor demanded, blood itself. To seduce another's wife was to wound the husband's reputation, a crime that rippled through entire families. The injured party could demand compensation, or he could demand vengeance. Both were lawful, both were expected. Even words carried weight. A man who composed a love poem about another man's wife might find himself dragged before the assembly, his verses treated as evidence of intent. Viking law knew the power of words to inflame, to wound, to shame. A stanza whispered in the hall could be taken as seduction, as insult, as open challenge. To mock a man as unmanly, to accuse a woman of looseness, these were not idle gossip. They were crimes, punishable by law, because they endangered the fragile balance of honor. For women, the law was both shield and snare. A wife betrayed by her husband's neglect could declare divorce openly, at bed and door, before witnesses. Yet, if she herself strayed, her punishment could be harsher, her reputation ruined beyond repair. The law watched her more closely, measured her more strictly, for her body carried the burden of legitimacy. If her fidelity was questioned, even falsely, her children's inheritance could be cast into doubt. The enslaved stood outside such protections. Their bodies were property, their violations unrecognized by law. A master could take, trade, or dismiss without fear of punishment. Only when disputes touched the honor of the free did the Althing stir. Thus, the enslaved bore their silence as the heaviest sentence of all. Punishments varied. Fines of silver, exile from community, or even death could be decreed. What mattered most was restoration of balance. Law in the Viking world was not abstract, it was lived, spoken, enforced by kin and neighbours. To ignore a slight was to invite ruin. To answer it through law was to preserve standing. The Althing, beneath open skies, became an extension of the longhouse hearth, ensuring that intimacy itself bowed before the order of society. Thus, the bed and the law were bound together. What began in whispered dark could end in shouted judgment. The Viking world recognized no boundary between the two, for sexuality was not hidden, it was public, communal, subject to scrutiny. In this way, the law stood guard even at the bedside, its shadow falling over every act of flesh. In the Viking world, words carried the weight of steel. A sword could cut a man's body, but a single insult could cut his honor, leaving wounds no healer could mend. Among these verbal blades, none struck deeper than those tied to sex. To call a man agra, unmanly, passive, shamefully soft, was not a jest. It was an accusation that shattered his place among warriors, kin, and gods. Such words could not be ignored. They demanded blood. The insult of unmanliness did not mean simple cowardice. It accused a man of taking the submissive role in intimacy, a position considered the destruction of his honor. In a society built on dominance, conquest, and strength, to suggest that a warrior yielded in bed was to strip him of all worth. The law codes confirm this. Such an insult was counted as a crime equal to theft or worse. A man accused had the right the obligation to challenge his accuser, often in duel. To remain silent was to accept the stain forever. Words, once spoken, spread like fire across thatched roofs, around the ale bench. Laughter at another's expense could ignite feuds lasting generations. To mock a man's virility, to suggest that his wife lay unsatisfied, was to provoke rage. Husbands defended not only their own names, but the honor of their kin. Blood could be spilled, not because a sword was drawn, but because a verse was sung too boldly. The sagas are heavy with such tales, where insults of the flesh lit the torch of feud. Women, too, bore the weight of words. A whisper that she was too free with her favours, a mocking verse questioning the paternity of her child, such words endangered her entire lineage. Her children's legitimacy could be doubted, her family's alliances weakened, her household shamed. Unlike men, she had fewer means to answer. Where men answered with steel, women often bore the silence, knowing that denial rarely erased suspicion. Yet some fought back with words of their own, sharp as any axe, defending their honour in the hall before kin and neighbours. Poets wielded this power most dangerously. Skalds could immortalise insult in verse. Their rhymes carried across seas and generations. A biting stanza could haunt a family longer than a scar from battle. Lawmakers knew this, and so even poetry could be judged a crime. To carve another's shame into memory was to invite vengeance. In this way, art and violence twined together, inseparable. Thus, in the Viking Age, words could kill. They were not idle chatter, but weapons honed as carefully as spears. To accuse, to mock, to compose a dangerous verse was to gamble with one's life. The insult of the flesh was more than laughter, it was war declared in sound. And when the echoes died down, they left behind silence heavy with consequence, a silence that could only be broken by blood. The cries of childbirth rose louder than war horns, filling the longhouse with a sound that struck fear deeper than any raid. To be a Viking woman was to walk daily with the shadow of death, and nowhere was that shadow darker than in the birthing bed. Every child brought forth was a gamble, life and lineage balanced against blood and breath. Fate and terror twined together as midwives worked by firelight, their hands stained, their voices steady, whispering prayers to both gods and spirits. For the Norse, childbirth was not only a private event, but a communal ordeal. Women gathered around the labouring motherkin, neighbours, sometimes thralls, each bearing witness, each ready to help or mourn. The hearth became altar, the chamber a battlefield, and the woman herself a warrior waging the fiercest fight of all. There was no silence here. Her screams echoed through the rafters, reminding every ear that the survival of the clan passed through her body. The danger was ever present. Without healers skilled in modern arts, every birth carried risk. Blood loss, infection, breech delivery. These were as lethal as any axe. Many women died young, their bodies spent after bearing child upon child. To perish in childbirth was not shame but honour, for she had given her life in service to kin and gods. The sagas remember such women, their sacrifice praised like that of warriors fallen in battle. Death in the bed of blood, they called it, equal to death upon the field. And yet, when life triumphed, joy spread like fire in dry grass. A healthy cry from the newborn, the sight of tiny limbs moving, the first breath drawn the household, erupted in relief. Midwives wrapped the child in wool, placed it in the mother's weary arms, and the clan's future was secured. A new life meant new hope. Another hand for the field, another warrior for the hall, another link in the chain of lineage. But survival was never guaranteed. Many infants perished within days, victims of cold, hunger, or weakness. A fragile child could be abandoned, left to the elements, for a household could not always afford to raise the weak. This was not cruelty as we think of it, but necessity in a world where famine and frost pressed hard. Each surviving child bore the unspoken weight of those who did not. The rituals of birth reflected both fear and hope. Charms of Thor's hammer hung above mothers, believed to protect them in the throes of labour. Offerings were made to Freya, goddess of fertility, or to lesser household spirits, asking that life be spared. Even so, fate ruled all. The Norns, it was believed, wove each child's destiny, at the moment of birth, their threads stronger than prayer. Thus childbirth was both terror and triumph. It was the truest test of a woman's endurance, the sharpest reminder of life's fragility, the most sacred duty she bore. In those hours of blood and breath, the Viking world held its future in trembling hands. And whether joy or grief followed, the household never forgot that its survival began in the cries of women at the edge of life and death. Not every woman who shared a Viking man's bed was wife or bride. Many were concubines, women bound to households without vows, without keys, without the full honor of law. They came from raids, from slave markets, from poorer families who sold daughters into service. Some were gifts sealed in alliances, others spoils of conquest carried across the sea. Though they bore children, tended hearths, and warmed furs, they lived always in the shadow of the wife, whose keys hung heavy with authority. Concubinage was no secret practice. It was permitted, even expected, among the powerful. A chieftain with land and wealth might keep one wife and several concubines, each assigned her place in the order of the household. Yet while the wife's name was etched into the law, the concubine's existence hovered in uncertainty. She could be dismissed at a word, traded like livestock, or given away as easily as a cloak. Her survival depended not on vows but on her ability to endure, to please, to remain useful. And still, the concubine's role was not without influence. Many bore children, and these offspring, though often marked as lesser, were still blood of the father. Sometimes acknowledged, sometimes ignored, they complicated inheritance, stirring jealousies within households. A favoured concubine could tilt the balance of power, her children raised beside the legitimate heirs, her whispers reaching the ear of the man she served. In this way, shadows held power, though fragile, always threatened by the wife's authority. Life for concubines varied. Some were treated with kindness, clothed and fed, protected as part of the household. Others endured cruelty. Their bodies demanded without consent, their dignity crushed beneath the weight of servitude. The sagas and law codes rarely speak of their voices, and this silence tells its own truth. Society did not see them as equal, only as extensions of the master's will. Their stories survive only in glimpses, lines where they appear unnamed, described only as a woman, reminders of how easily they could be forgotten. For wives, concubines were both tolerated and despised. A wife's honour lay in managing the household, but her place was threatened if a concubine's influence grew too strong. Jealousies flared, disputes erupted, sometimes violence followed. The household was not only bound by fire and kinship, but also strained by rivalries in the bed. Yet law offered the wife her shield. Concubines could never hold her keys, could never replace her in status. Still, the threat lingered, and women bore it as another trial in the endless struggle of survival. Concubinage revealed the hierarchy of Viking sexuality. At its heart was not passion but power, who ruled, who endured, who held keys, who slept in shadows. The wife guarded honour, the concubine bore silence. And though both shared the same fire, the same roof, their fates were written differently in the memory of kin and saga. Thus the concubine's life was lived in twilight, half visible, half forgotten. She carried children, kindled warmth, and shaped households, yet her name faded before ink touched parchment. In the Viking world, she was a vessel of flesh and duty, forever bound to shadows that never loosened their hold. Beneath the rafters of the longhouse, not all bodies belonged to themselves. Among the thralls the enslaved, the unfree their flesh was counted as property, no different from the oxen in the byre or the tools hanging from the beams. They tilled the soil, chopped the firewood, ground the grain, and when demanded, surrendered their bodies to their masters. For them, intimacy was not choice, not covenant, not honour. It was command. The sagas speak little of thralls in this regard, and the law codes speak only of rights belonging to their owners. A thrall woman, could be forced to share a bed, her silence assumed, her protest unrecorded. If she bore a child, that child's fate was uncertain, sometimes claimed, sometimes cast aside, sometimes sold. Such offspring were shadows in the lineage, acknowledged when convenient, erased when not. Their lives depended on the whims of the free, their worth measured not in kinship but in utility. Men, too, were vulnerable. An enslaved man might be humiliated by being forced into acts meant to break his spirit, his role twisted into insult against his masculinity. Yet even here, the shame was counted not upon him, but upon the master who wielded him as weapon. The thrall's own voice was absent. In this silence lies the heaviest weight of all. Their experiences were unworthy of record, their suffering erased by indifference. And yet, these unfree lives were woven into the daily fabric of Viking society. They raised the children of their masters, carried the firewood that warmed the halls, prepared the feasts where poets sang of love and honour. Their labour fed the hearth, but their bodies, too, were taken as if no different from the grain they ground. To survive, many learned to endure with stillness, to mask their suffering, to find small footholds of resilience within their captivity. There are faint traces in the stories of those who rose from shadow. A favoured thrall might be freed, granted land, or taken as concubine with higher standing. A child of such a union might be acknowledged, woven into the bloodline despite their half-born status. But these were rare exceptions. Most lived and died unnamed, their bones buried outside the cairns of the honoured, their stories swallowed by the earth. The presence of thralls reveals the raw hierarchy of Viking sexuality. At the top stood the wife, guarded by law and honour. Beneath her, concubines, tolerated yet fragile. And below them, the enslaved, whose bodies were denied even the pretense of consent. It was a ladder carved from power, and at its lowest rung lay those with no defence, their dignity stolen, their voices silenced. Thus, the saga of Viking intimacy is incomplete without the shadows. For while skalds sang of heroes and queens, countless thralls lay forgotten, their lives measured only in labour and use. In their silence, one truth resounds. The Viking world, for all its honour and law, was built upon bodies that were never allowed to belong to themselves. In Viking society, marriage was no union of hearts alone. It was a bargain, a weaving of families, wealth, and lineage into a knot that bound households together. Love, if it came at all, was a later guest. The true marriage was struck in oaths, silver, and cattle, its foundation built not on desire, but on duty. To wed was to secure alliances, to strengthen claims to land, to ensure heirs who would bear the blood of both lines. The ceremony itself revealed this truth. Families gathered in solemn witness, negotiations already settled long before the bride and groom touched hands. Dowry flowed from the bride's family, cloth woven through long winters, livestock fattened for trade, sometimes even weapons forged in the fire. In return, the groom's kin offered the munda, the bride price, silver or land paid as proof of the union's value. These exchanges were not tokens but contracts, as binding as any rune carved in stone. On the day of the wedding, keys were placed in the bride's hand, heavy iron or bronze, clinking with the weight of her new role. They were more than objects. They were symbols of her rule over the household stores, food, drink, textiles, and the labour of servants. The groom, in turn, received a sword from her family, a weapon that carried not only steel but lineage. With keys and blade, wife and husband stood joined, one keeper of the hearth, the other wielder of force. The feast that followed was loud with laughter, brimming with ale, echoing with boasts and songs. Yet beneath the merriment was the unspoken knowledge that the marriage bed was another form of oath. The bride's virginity confirmed her family's honour. Her fertility promised heirs to till fields and defend land. The groom's stamina and strength in that bed proved his manhood as much as any battle. What happened beneath the furs was not hidden from judgment. It was the seal on the bargain struck between families. But this bargain was never equal. A man might take concubines without losing honour, though whispers might follow. A woman's fidelity, by contrast, was watched like a hawk. Her body carried the burden of legitimacy, for in her womb lay the question of whose blood would inherit the farm, the cattle, the sword. A single rumour of infidelity could undo everything, making the marriage a hollow shell, its alliance broken. And yet, marriages were not loveless cages for all. Some sagas speak of couples who grew into affection, their partnership forged in respect and shared survival. A husband returning from the sea might find warmth in his wife's embrace, not only in duty, but in genuine bond. A wife, entrusted with the household, might wield her authority with wisdom, her husband seeking her counsel before every raid. Love sometimes bloomed within the bargain, though it was never its foundation. Thus, marriage in the Viking world was not a sanctuary of private desire, but a cornerstone of society. It was contract and covenant, bargain and bond, where silver and blood mixed as surely as ale and song. To marry was not to indulge the heart. It was to shoulder the future of kin, to tie the fates of families, to live within a vow as enduring as the timber beams of the longhouse itself. For a Viking bride, the wedding was not an end, but a beginning, heavy with expectation. Her body was proof, her silence a seal, her first night a trial by fire. The feast that filled the longhouse with laughter and ale was but a prelude. When the torches guttered low, all eyes turned toward the furs where she and her husband were led. Privacy was scarce, and though the hearth fire dimmed, kin and thralls alike were never far. Every whisper, every movement, carried through timber walls. The union was not only for husband and wife, it was for the families bound together by silver and oath. The bride's virginity was guarded as fiercely as any treasure. It was her family's currency, the assurance that the blood of future heirs would be untainted, the alliance between households secure. On that first night, her honour became proof not only of herself, but of her kin. If she faltered, if rumour whispered that she was not untouched, shame fell upon all who bore her name. In a world where lineage was power, a single stain could unravel alliances built over generations. Yet the burden stretched beyond chastity. Fertility was demanded, for a barren wife was a hollow promise. The saga's whisper of women sent away, cast aside when their wombs bore no heirs. For a bride, the wedding night was not only trial, but the opening of a lifelong ordeal, to endure, to conceive, to deliver. Each month that passed without swelling belly was a judgment. Each birth, whether life or death, was a reckoning. She carried the weight of continuity on her shoulders, for the survival of the clan passed through her flesh. And there was fear. Not every union was tender. Some brides were taken with force, their cries muffled by laughter in the hall. Others bore husbands many years older, strangers bound to them by bargain rather than affection. A young woman might dread her first night as much as she dreaded the grave, knowing that refusal was not an option. For in the Viking world, a wife was duty first, desire second. But even within this burden, there was room for strength. Some brides wielded their silence as shield, others their cunning as weapon. A whispered word to kin, a firm hand over household keys, a careful shaping of sons and daughters, these were the tools by which women carved their power. The burden of the bride could break her, but it could also forge her into the true mistress of the hall. Thus, the Viking bride entered her new life, not as maiden alone, but as vessel of honour, bearer of lineage, and keeper of alliances. Her burden was heavy, yet through endurance she secured not only her place, but the survival of all who depended on her. In her silence, in her suffering, in her strength, the saga of the clan was written. For a Viking groom, the wedding feast was not his true trial. The songs, the ale, the clashing of horns, all of it faded into nothing compared to the moment he lay beneath the gaze of his household and the burden of expectation pressed down upon him. His duty was not only to take a wife, but to prove his manhood in the bed, to show stamina that matched his strength in the field. To falter, to finish too soon, to leave a wife unsatisfied. These were not private failings. They were whispers waiting to spread through the hall, cutting deeper than any sword. In a society where honor was currency, a man's virility was part of his worth. His ability to endure in the act was measured as keenly as his skill in battle. The sagas hint at this unspoken truth. Men, mocked for weakness, praised for stamina, judged as much for what they did beneath the furs as what they achieved with steel. For some, this became a matter of boasting. Around the ale bench, warriors might laugh about their hours of endurance, comparing the conquest of wives to the conquest of enemies. But beneath the laughter lay a sharper truth. Reputation was fragile, and failure in the bed could follow a man like a curse. The groom's first night was a proving ground. His wife's kin listened for her cries, his neighbours for the rhythm of the act. In the smoky silence of the longhouse, there was no secrecy. The walls bore witness, the rafters remembered. If he proved himself strong, when his reputation spread like fire, this was a man of vigour, a man who could father heirs, a man who deserved respect. But if he faltered, shame coiled around his name, whispered in corners, sung in mocking verse by poets who knew the sting of scandal. This pressure did not fade after the wedding night. It followed him through the years, for every union was weighed by eyes unseen. A barren household could cast suspicion on him as easily as on his wife. Was he weak? Was his blood thin? Did his body fail? Each child born silenced such whispers, each year without an heir sharpened them. His manhood was bound not to pleasure, not to love, but to the relentless demand for endurance and offspring. And yet some men found pride in this burden. To outlast, to endure, to dominate the night. As one dominated the battlefield, this was proof of worth. A silent victory shouted in reputation. In sagas and in lore, manhood was inseparable from virility. His sword was not only the iron in his hand, but the flesh he wielded in bed, both instruments of honour, both weapons of survival. Thus, the Viking groom carried a weight as heavy as his bride's. For her, chastity and fidelity. For him, stamina and strength. Together, they were bound in a union less of love than of duty, a bond judged not only by themselves, but by the world around them. In the Viking Age, a man's name lived or died as much in the sheets as on the field of war. In the Viking world, fidelity was demanded, but never equally. For the wife, loyalty to her husband was absolute. Her body was his honour, her womb his lineage, her silence his safeguard against whispers of illegitimacy. To stray was to endanger not only herself but her kin, for the child of another man would cast doubt upon inheritance, fracture alliances, and stain the reputation of all who bore her blood. The law was clear. A woman caught in adultery could be beaten, cast out, or worse, depending on the severity of her betrayal. Her shame was communal, carried like a burden by the entire household. For the husband, the rules bent with power. A man of wealth or status might keep concubines or take pleasure with thralls, his reputation untouched so long as he provided for his wife and honoured the household. These liaisons, though often tolerated, simmered beneath the surface. A wife might despise her rival, but the law stood behind her husband, not her. Fidelity was demanded of women as law, but for men it was measured more by discretion than prohibition. So long as the household remained intact, his wanderings were shadows, tolerated, though not always forgiven. This double standard bred tension within longhouses. A wife might be expected to endure her husband's other unions while guarding her own chastity with silence as sharp as steel. Jealousies flared, especially when concubines bore children. A wife's sons stood above them in inheritance, but the presence of half-brothers created cracks in the foundation of kinship. Disputes arose not from the man's wandering but from the rivalries it sparked, the feuds that spilled from bed to hall. And yet, a man could not act without limit. To seduce the wife of another free man was perilous, a crime judged not only by law, but by the swords of kin. To steal another's honour was to invite feud, for women were more than companions, they were vessels of lineage, their fidelity the thread that held households together. In this way, a man's fidelity was judged not against his wife, but against the rights of his peers. To dishonour another man's marriage was to strike at his standing, and the insult demanded repayment in silver or blood. Women, however, found ways to endure, and sometimes to resist. Some invoked law to leave husbands who shamed them with neglect or abuse. Divorce, though rare, was possible spoken aloud at bed and door with kin as witness. Others wielded silence and cunning, guarding their reputations even as they navigated the harsh double standard. Their fidelity was demanded, their endurance assumed, their power measured in the subtle ways they held households together despite the burdens placed upon them. Thus, fidelity in the Viking world was not a shared vow, but a divided law. Women carried its weight like chains, men balanced it with privilege and caution. The double standard was not hidden, it was known, spoken, and enforced. And in its harshness, it revealed the truth of Viking society. Survival was not built on fairness, but on honour, power, and the endurance of those forced to bear the heavier load. The Viking longhouse was a hall of timber and smoke, but it was also a hall of eyes. A husband and wife did not retreat into chambers, for no such rooms existed. Around the hearth lay sons and daughters, kin and thralls, servants and fosterlings, all wrapped in cloaks, all pretending to sleep. And when the furs shifted, when the whispers turned to muffled sounds, the household became an audience. Privacy was a dream for kings and gods. For common folk, every act was performed beneath the gaze of others. Imagine the weight of it. To reach for your wife, knowing your cousin lies 2 arms' lengths away, listening though he dares not stir. The thrall in the corner, her eyes shut but her ears open, hears every muffled groan. The children, half asleep, shift in their blankets. The rafters creak with the rhythm of bodies, and the firelight throws shadows against the beams. The household does not speak of it, not openly, but all remember. By dawn, silence carries judgment heavier than words. Reputation was born in these moments. A man who faltered beneath the furs invited whispers at the ale bench. A woman whose cries were too sharp might be mocked as shameless. A couple too quiet might be suspected of failure. In the Viking world, sex was not private indulgence, but a communal matter, weighed and measured by the very walls of the house. No deed went unseen, no sound unheard, for the longhouse itself was both witness and judge. This closeness forged both shame and strength. For some, the watching eyes were a torment, turning intimacy into ordeal. For others, they became proof. A warrior's endurance, a wife's obedience, the shared duty of creating heirs, all confirmed by those who pretended to sleep nearby. What was endured in the night was spoken of in the morning, woven into the household's silent memory, unspoken yet never forgotten. The thralls bore the heaviest burden. They were servants, yet also spectators, unable to leave, forced to carry their master's secrets like chains. Sometimes they became unwilling participants, taken in the night with others listening close by. Their silence was demanded, their suffering dismissed. And still they remembered, and their memories fed the undercurrent of rumour that flowed like smoke through the community. Even laughter played its role. At feasts, a poet might sing a mocking verse, veiled but sharp, hinting at a night too noisy or a man too quick to finish. The audience laughed, but the target carried the weight of that verse long after the echoes died. The household that had watched in silence became a community that judged aloud. Thus, the Viking home was never a sanctuary of privacy. It was a stage, its beams and rafters heavy with memory. Every act of flesh was a performance, every whisper a risk, every silence a shield. In the watching household, sex was never only between two, so it was a matter for all, binding the fate of honour to the smoke-filled air. In the Viking world, words could carve wounds deeper than iron. A sword might pierce the flesh, but a stanza could pierce the soul, branding a man or woman with shame that lingered long after bruises faded. Poetry was no gentle pastime, it was weapon, judgment, and curse, carried on the tongues of skalds, whose verses spread faster than smoke from the hearth. And nowhere did their sting cut sharper than in matters of sex. A skald could stand at the ale bench, cup in hand, and weave words that seemed harmless to the untrained ear. Yet, beneath the rhythm lay venom. A husband mocked as weak in the bed, a wife whispered of as too eager, a thrall described as favoured by her master. Such verses spread like fire through the hall. Once spoken, they could not be silenced. The memory of words endured, sung again and again, until the insult became truth in the minds of all who heard it. Law recognized the power of these songs. To accuse a man of being arger and manly, submissive in the bed through verse, was a crime punishable by duel or fine. Such insults endangered not only the man, but his entire kin, for honour was shared and dishonour was contagious. A family mocked in song might rise in fury, demanding blood to wash away the stain. Thus, the poet walked a narrow path, admired for his craft, but feared for his power, his tongue as dangerous as any axe. Women, too, were vulnerable to such shaming. A verse that hinted at unfaithfulness could undo years of guarded conduct. A single line suggesting her child was not her husband's could fracture alliances, cast doubt on inheritance, and strip her of dignity. Unlike men, women had little recourse. They could not call for duels, and denial often rang hollow against the weight of a well-crafted poem. Their defence lay in silence, in kin who spoke for them, or in the slow endurance of outlasting the rumour. Yet not all songs were cruel. Some praised fidelity, fertility, and strength, raising reputations higher with every telling. A husband might be honoured in verse as vigorous, a wife as noble and faithful. These songs became treasures, passed through generations, ensuring that their names were remembered not with laughter but with pride. But for every song of praise, there was another waiting to shame, for mockery was as much a part of Viking life as valour. The hall itself became a battleground of words. Fire crackled, ale spilled, and laughter roared, but beneath it all lay tension. For at any moment, a poet could raise his voice, and the life of a man or woman could be changed forever. Steel could be parried. A verse, once loosed, could not. Thus, songs that shamed carried more weight than the clash of blades. They were memory sharpened into weapon, honour balanced on rhyme, reputation hanging by syllables. And in the Viking Age, to be mocked in verse was to feel the cut of a wound no healing hand could close. For a Viking woman, the swelling of her belly was both triumph and terror. Each missed moon meant her body had answered its duty, yet every heartbeat carried risk. Pregnancy was no gentle passage, it was a gamble played with blood and bone, where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and the survival of a clan. The household watched closely, measuring her value by the curve of her womb, waiting for proof that the marriage bargain bore fruit. The joy of conception was heavy with expectation. A fertile wife secured her place, her kin's reputation, and her husband's honour. Songs might praise her, neighbours whisper blessings, and the longhouse stir with hope for an heir. But beneath the cheer lurked the shadow of mortality. Without healers, without iron instruments of safety, childbirth claimed as many women as the battlefield claimed men. The sagas are quiet on their deaths, yet archaeology tells of women buried young, their bones still carrying the marks of perilous labours. Every pregnancy was a storm endured. Midwives prepared herbs, charms of Thor's hammer hung over hearths, and prayers rose to Freya, goddess of fertility. Still, fate was merciless. A child might turn within, its head caught in the birth canal. Blood might flow too freely, leaving the mother pale and fading as kin wailed around her. The womb could give life or claim it, and no family knew which it would be until the moment passed. To die in childbirth was not seen as failure but as sacrifice, a death in the bed of blood, equal in honour to a warrior's fall on the field. And if the mother survived, the child's fate remained uncertain. A strong cry at birth meant hope. A weak, silent breath meant despair. Some infants were too frail, their limbs twisted, their bodies too weak for the brutal world beyond the womb. In some households, the hard decision was made to expose the child, leaving it to frost or earth, for the clan could not afford to nurture weakness. This too was part of the gamble. The womb could deliver heirs or burdens, blessings or curses, and the line between them was thin as a blade. Yet, when a child thrived, joy poured through the hall like mead from a horn. The father lifted the newborn, claimed it before kin, and sprinkled water to mark its name. In that moment, survival outweighed the suffering. A new hand would one day sow the fields, wield the sword, or carry forward the name of ancestors. For the woman, each living child was both shield and chain securing her position in the household, even as her body bore scar after scar from the trials of birth. The pregnancy gamble was the truest crucible of Viking life. It revealed the fragility of existence, the thin line between triumph and tragedy, and the raw truth that survival demanded sacrifice. For every heir born strong, countless mothers and infants lay beneath the earth, silent witnesses to the cost of lineage. In the Viking world, the womb was as dangerous as the battlefield, and its victories came only through peril. Unlike many lands where marriage was a binding chain with no release, the Vikings carved out a harsher but freer path. Divorce was possible, and it was not whispered in secrecy. It was spoken aloud with fire, witnessed by kin, neighbours, and thralls. A wife who could no longer endure her husband's neglect, his cruelty, or his failure to provide, might take her stand at the threshold of their shared bed, then at the door of the longhouse, and declare before witnesses, "I divorce you." These words, carried into the smoke-filled rafters, severed the bond as surely as an axe stroke splits wood. This freedom was not mercy, it was survival. A woman abandoned to misery, or left without provision, could not sustain herself in the harsh northern world. Divorce gave her a way to preserve honour and safeguard her children. In some cases, she returned to her kin, her dowry intact, her dignity defended by law. In others, she remarried quickly, weaving her fate once more into the bargain of families. The act was not light. It risked scandal, whispers, and judgment, yet it was recognized as lawful, even necessary. For men, the path to divorce was easier. A husband could cast away a wife for barrenness, for unfaithfulness, for neglect of household duties. He, too, declared it before witnesses, his voice carrying across the hall. His standing suffered little. Often he remarried swiftly, trading one alliance for another. Yet law demanded fairness. The dowry returned, the bride price forfeited, settlements agreed upon, so that disputes did not fester into feuds. The sagas are filled with stories of such dissolutions, each tinged with bitterness. A wife leaving a violent husband, a husband rejecting a wife suspected of infidelity. Sometimes, divorce was wielded like a weapon in the endless struggle for honour. A proud woman might leave not for cruelty, but for insult, declaring that her husband's weakness had shamed her. A man might reject a wife whose kin had fallen from power, severing the bond before it dragged him down. Yet, even in separation, the threads of kinship remained tangled. Children bound divorced parents together, their inheritance contested, their loyalties strained. A son might side with his father, a daughter with her mother. Families divided, alliances shifted, feuds sparked. Divorce was not merely the end of a marriage, It was a tremor that rippled through the hall, shaking foundations built on fragile bargains. Still, the freedom to part gave Viking society a strange resilience. Marriages were not prisons, they were contracts, and contracts could be broken. Women were not voiceless. They could speak their refusal, demand release, and walk away with their honor, so long as they followed the proper ritual. In this, the North was harsher, yet freer than much of Christendom, where women bore chains they could never break. Thus, divorce in the Viking world was not failure but another form of endurance. It revealed the raw truth that survival mattered more than permanence, that honor weighed heavier than vows. The hall echoed with endings as much as beginnings, each declaration a reminder that even bonds of flesh and oath could be severed when necessity demanded. In the smoky half-light of the longhouse, where furs and straw were shared by many, the cries of a newborn could carry more than joy, they could carry questions. When the child was born to a concubine, shadows grew heavier, whispers sharper. For such a child stood on uncertain ground. It was the blood of the master, yet not the child of a wife. Its place in the household teetered between acceptance and denial, its fate bound to the will of men and the endurance of the woman who bore it. Some concubines bore sons, who were acknowledged, raised beside legitimate heirs, given weapons, and trained in the arts of war. They were half-brothers, often rivals, tolerated but never entirely trusted. The wife's children carried the lawful claim, yet the concubine's sons carried the same blood, the same strength of lineage. In times of weakness or dispute, they could rise, pressing their claim with sword and shield, reminding all that though their mothers lacked keys, their father's blood ran true. Others, however, were not so fortunate. A concubine's child might be dismissed, set aside, given no inheritance, and left to carve out survival in the shadows. Some were sold into slavery, their existence an inconvenience to the household. Others grew up within the hall, tolerated yet unnamed in the sagas, their lives absorbed into the silence of forgotten kin. Their mothers endured the weight of uncertainty, knowing that at any moment their children might be cast aside. The wife's place determined much. A jealous or fearful wife might press her husband to reject the child, protecting her own heirs from rivals. A shrewder wife, however, might see advantage in raising the child within her household, binding it to her authority, ensuring loyalty where danger lurked. For the child itself was not to blame, it was a vessel of potential, one that could fracture or fortify the household depending on how it was treated. Law offered little clarity, inheritance was bound to legitimacy, yet power often bent law. A strong son of a concubine, proven in battle, could not easily be ignored. In some sagas, these children rose to prominence, carving names for themselves despite the stigma of their birth. Their mother's low status clung to them like smoke, yet their deeds could burn brighter, forcing acknowledgement from kin who once scorned them. For daughters, the path was narrower. A concubine's daughter might be married off to a lesser man, her worth measured by her father's recognition. Some were given away entirely, their names vanishing into obscurity, yet even here, quiet influence persisted. A daughter born in shadow might become the mother of warriors, her lineage remembered not in her own time, but in the strength of her descendants. Thus, the concubine's child lived always on the edge part of the household, yet apart from it, blood of the master, but never fully his kin. Their existence revealed the fragile balance of Viking life, where survival was bound not only to law, but to power, not only to birth, but to will. In their uncertain fates, we glimpse the unspoken truth. In the North, lineage was as much weapon as bond, and every child, legitimate or shadow-born, carried the power to shape the saga of the hall. In the dim corners of the longhouse, where the fire's warmth barely reached, the enslaved women bore their children. Unlike the wives whose labours were surrounded by kin and ritual, the thrall mother entered childbirth with little protection, her cries muffled by indifference. Her body was not her own, her womb not a vessel of honor, but property of her master. The child she carried was his decision, not hers, its future uncertain before it ever drew breath. When an enslaved woman gave birth, the household often regarded the event with cold calculation rather than joy. If the child was strong, it might be kept, raised as another hand to labor in the fields, grind the grain, or tend the hearth. If weak, unwanted, or born at an inconvenient time, the child could be discarded, abandoned to frost or silence, its life ended without ceremony. For the thrall mother, the miracle of birth was never shielded from the brutality of ownership. Yet there were moments when blood overcame law. Some masters acknowledged their children by enslaved women, allowing them to grow in the hall beside the heirs of the wife. These children, though never free of the stain of their mother's bondage, carried the master's blood, and in that fact lay both possibility and danger. They could stir jealousies, threaten inheritances, and fracture households. The wife watched closely, her keys heavy at her belt. For every concubine and enslaved woman's child was a shadow cast across her own son's future. For the mother herself, survival depended on silence and endurance. She could not claim her child openly, for the law denied her such rights. She could not protect it from being sold or given away. Her love was lived in glances, in stolen touches, in whispered songs sung when the hall slept. And yet, through that quiet devotion, enslaved mothers preserved threads of humanity that the chains of bondage sought to sever. Some children of thralls rose above their station. In rare cases they were freed, given small plots of land, or taken into fosterage by kin who sought to ease old debts. A few became warriors, their strength winning them a place among free men despite the mark of their birth. But these were exceptions, and most lived and died as their mothers had bound to labor, bound to silence, bound to the will of others. The sagas, written by free men, rarely record their names. Their absence speaks volumes. The enslaved mothers and their children were the hidden foundation of Viking society, their toil feeding the hearths, their suffering unspoken. Without them, fields would wither, halls would grow cold, feasts would empty. Yet their lives remained in shadow, their stories erased. Thus, the enslaved mother carried the heaviest burden of all. Her womb bore children into bondage, her love silenced by law, her legacy remembered only in fragments. In her suffering, we glimpse the raw truth of Viking life, that beneath the sagas of kings and warriors lay countless unnamed women, whose bodies sustained the world even as their voices were denied. In the Viking world, a man's body and a woman's reputation could be destroyed not only by blade or betrayal, but by words alone. Among the most dangerous insults were those tied to sex. These were not idle taunts, shouted in anger. They were accusations that cut at the very root of honor, striking deeper than wounds of iron. To accuse a man of being agra unmanly, effeminate, or submissive in intimacy was to brand him with a stain that could never be washed clean, except through blood. The insult of Aga carried lethal weight because it attacked the essence of masculinity. A Viking's worth was measured by dominance, in war, in household, in bed. To suggest that a warrior yielded rather than conquered in the act was to unmake him in the eyes of his peers. No oath, no silver, no laughter could soften such a charge. The law itself recognized it. A man so accused had the right to challenge his accuser, and if he did not, the silence itself was taken as confession. Thus, a single word could drag men into duels, ignite feuds, and send kin lines into spirals of vengeance. For women, the verbal blades were different, but no less deadly. To call her unfaithful, to hint that her children were not her husband's, was to unravel her household's honor. Such words could strip heirs of legitimacy, turn allies into enemies, and cast shame across generations. Unlike men, women could not answer such insults with sword in hand. They endured them in silence, or relied on husbands and kin to defend their names. Yet the damage was often done before a blow was struck, for rumour spread like fire across thatched roofs, devouring reputations in its path. Poets and skalds wielded this power with the sharpest precision. A verse slipped into a song, a mocking line delivered at a feast, could bring ruin. Once sung, a stanza could not be recalled. Its rhythm carried it from hall to hall, village to village, fixing shame into memory more enduring than scars. Men who were mocked in verse sometimes carried the insult to their graves, their names forever shadowed by laughter. Women, too, were bound by these words, their fidelity and chastity debated in lines of poetry long after their lives had ended. But insult was not always open attack. Sometimes it was wrapped in jest, a half smile at the ale bench, a sly phrase that everyone understood, but none repeated outright. These veiled barbs could be more dangerous than shouted accusations, for they spread quietly, gaining force with every retelling. The victim, trapped, knew the laughter, hid a knife, but could not grasp it directly. Thus, insults of the flesh were more than words. They were weapons, sharpened by custom, sanctioned by law, and feared by all. In a society where honour was life itself, such words could kill as surely as spears. Every Viking walked the hall, knowing that reputation balanced on the tongue of others, that one verse, one insult, could topple what years of valour had built. In the north, the flesh was fragile, not only to wounds, but to words. The Viking world was never far from the gaze of its gods, and the bed was no exception. Where law and custom dictated honour, myth revealed a deeper truth. Even the divine were tangled in the snares of desire and shame. The sagas tell of gods who shifted shape, who lay with giants and beasts, who blurred the lines of man and woman. These tales were not whispered in secrecy. They were spoken aloud around the hearth, shaping how men and women understood their own flesh. Odin, All-Father and Wanderer, sought wisdom even in forbidden acts. He mastered the seether, a form of sorcery taught by the goddess Freya, but in doing so he accepted a practice branded as unmanly for mortal men. To wield this magic was to risk whispers of Agra, yet Odin bore the shame for the sake of power. In this, the myths reminded men that strength sometimes demanded endurance of dishonour, even for the highest god. Loki, the trickster, blurred boundaries most of all. He was father to monsters, and yet also mother, having once taken the shape of a mare and birthed Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed. His shifting roles unsettled mortals, for in his tales they saw the fragile lines that held their own reputations together. Loki's mockery at feasts, accusing goddesses of promiscuity and gods of cowardice, mirrored the deadly insults of human halls. Through him, the myths gave divine weight to the power of words, the way shame could scar deeper than steel. Freya embodied fertility and desire, worshipped as giver of life, yet mocked in stories for her many lovers. She wept tears of gold for husbands lost, yet her name was twisted into insults thrown at women accused of looseness. Men wore her image as amulet, seeking her blessing for childbirth and harvest, even as they shamed mortal women by comparing them to her. In this contradiction lay the truth of Viking sexuality. The sacred and the scandalous could not be torn apart. Thor, bringer of thunder, was mocked too. In one tale, when his hammer was stolen, he disguised himself as a bride to retrieve it. The story is told in laughter, yet beneath the humour lingers unease. What did it mean for the strongest of gods to wear a woman's veil? In retelling, mortals wrestled with their own fears of dishonour, of being seen as weak, of crossing the invisible boundaries of gender and role. These myths did not exist apart from daily life. They were mirrors, showing men and women that even gods were ensnared by desire, mocked for their choices, bound by the same fragile web of honour and shame. To laugh at Thor in a bridal gown, to whisper about Loki's shifting flesh, was to acknowledge the dangers faced in their own halls. Thus, The gods themselves bore witness to the burdens of the bed. They showed that desire could grant life or ruin, that shame lingered even in the halls of Asgard. In their tales, mortals found both caution and comfort, reminders that no one, not even the divine, escaped the weight of flesh, the bite of words, or the judgment of honour. In the Viking world, fertility was not left to chance. It was too vital, too dangerous, too entwined with survival to be trusted only to the whims of flesh. Charms hung in longhouses, prayers were whispered at the hearth, and rituals were performed in sacred groves, all meant to bend fate toward life rather than death. Every household knew that children were its future, that barren fields and barren wombs brought the same ruin. Thus, fertility became both sacred duty and communal obsession. Amulets were everywhere. Small hammers of Thor, carved in silver or bone, were worn by women as protectors during childbirth, their weight pressing against the chest as both shield and plea. Runes were scratched on wood, antler, or stone, carved into bedposts, doors, or the very beams of the longhouse, their shapes binding the household to divine favour. Men, too, bore charms, for their virility was judged no less harshly. A warrior mocked for weakness in bed might clasp an amulet tighter than his sword, hoping for strength to endure. Seasonal rituals bound the community together in prayer for fertility, both of the land and the body. At spring gatherings, sacrifices were made, cattle, boars, sometimes horses, blood spilling onto the soil as gift to the gods. In these moments, the earth and womb were seen as one, both needing nourishment, both demanding tribute. Fires roared, mead flowed, and chants rose into the night, asking for full harvests, strong children, and survival through the next cruel winter. In private, women turned to herbs and hidden practices. Midwives carried secret knowledge, plants that encouraged conception, others that soothed pain, still others that ended unwanted pregnancies. Their lore was whispered from mother to daughter, guarded fiercely, for in their hands lay power over life and death. A barren woman might seek a potion, a charm, or the blessing of a sacred stone, hoping to shift her fate. A woman who had too many mouths to feed might turn to the same midwife for darker remedies, hidden from the eyes of men. Sacred places played their role as well. Stones carved with ancient figures, groves where the gods were believed to walk, streams whose waters were thought to heal. Couples visited them in hope of blessing. Offerings were left, cloth tied to branches, silver dropped into wells, loaves of bread placed upon stones. These were not idle gestures, but desperate bargains, reminders that survival depended as much on divine favour as on human endurance. And yet, even with charms and rituals, fate could not be bent fully. Stillbirths came, mothers died, fields failed, the Norns wove threads that no prayer could cut. But the rituals themselves gave hope, anchoring people against despair, reminding them that they had acted, that they had pleaded, that they had given what they could. Thus, fertility was never only flesh, it was symbol, ritual, and offering, woven into the rhythm of Viking life. To bear children was to fulfill one's duty. To invoke the gods was to share the burden with powers greater than man. In every charm and sacrifice, the North confessed its truth. Survival was never certain, but it was always pursued with fire, blood, and faith. Adultery in the Viking world was no small trespass. It was not only betrayal of love, it was theft. Theft of lineage, theft of honour, theft of certainty in the blood that bound kin together. A wife who strayed risked more than her own life. She risked unravelling the very threads that tied households into alliances, for if her child was not her husband's, then inheritance itself was poisoned. The price for such betrayal was steep, and its echoes could reach from hall to grave. For women, the law was merciless. To be caught in another man's bed was to court ruin. Some were beaten, others cast out, their dowry stripped, their names blackened beyond repair. In the harshest cases, death was demanded. carried out by husband or kin who refused to bear the stain of dishonour. The sagas hint at such endings, where whispers of adultery became sparks that lit feuds, driving men to bloodshed in the name of protecting their household's pride. For men, the burden was different. To lie with another's wife was to provoke vengeance, for it was seen not only as lust but as insult. He had trespassed upon another man's honour, endangered his lineage, and mocked his standing in the eyes of the community. Such an act could not go unanswered. Compensation might be demanded in silver, but more often the insult was washed away in blood. Husbands challenged adulterers to duels, or kin rose to defend the family's reputation. Adultery thus became spark for feud, its flames spreading far beyond the bed where it began. Yet the double standard remained. A man who lay with thralls or concubines was rarely punished. So long as he honoured his wife, provided for his household, and did not trespass upon the wife of another free man, his wanderings were tolerated. But for women, fidelity was absolute. Her body was the vessel of certainty, and any crack in that certainty threatened the balance of inheritance. Thus, the punishment for her straying was harsher, her shame heavier, her peril greater. Communities remembered such scandals. They were sung in mocking verses, whispered in corners of the hall, recorded in sagas where honour and betrayal stood side by side. Even generations later, descendants bore the weight of their ancestors' shame. A woman branded unfaithful, a man marked as seducer, their names lived on as warnings, their stories retold to remind others of the dangers of desire unchecked. And yet, not all accusations were true. Sometimes a husband, eager to rid himself of a wife, spread false claims of adultery. Sometimes, jealous rivals wove lies into verse. In such cases, law provided a thin shield, allowing women to call kin as witnesses to demand trial, but the stain was rarely erased. Once spoken, suspicion clung like smoke, and innocence was never enough to clear it fully. Thus, adultery in the Viking world was not merely a sin of passion, it was a crime of consequence, judged by law, punished by kin, and remembered in saga. Its price was measured in silver, in blood, and in the weight of ruined names that lingered long after the bodies were gone. When the time of birth arrived, the fate of mother and child often rested not in the hands of the gods alone, but in the skill of midwives. These women, often old, weathered, and steeped in knowledge handed down through generations, were guardians of life and keepers of secrets. Their hands carried herbs, their mouths carried chants, and their eyes carried memories of countless births, some joyous, some tragic, all etched into the silence of the hall. The midwife's tools were simple, yet they bore the weight of survival. Bundles of herbs hung from her belt, juniper for cleansing, mugwort for easing labour, yarrow for stemming blood. She brought with her charms and whispered prayers, sometimes to Freya, goddess of fertility, sometimes to Thor, whose hammer was invoked for protection. A small hammer carved from bone might be pressed into the labouring woman's palm, a symbol of strength in the hour of terror. In these acts, the line between medicine and magic blurred, for both were needed in equal measure. She also carried knowledge unspoken in law codes or sagas, which herbs might hasten labour, which might quiet pain, which could end a pregnancy when survival demanded it. These were secrets whispered from one midwife to another, never carved in runes for fear of censure. For though their work was vital, midwives walked a dangerous path. To succeed was to be praised as blessed. To fail was to risk being whispered of as cursed. Their arts blamed for deaths that were inevitable. The midwife was also witness. She knew which child was born strong, which frail, which perhaps not the husband's at all. Her silence was a treasure, her words a blade. A careless remark could destroy a woman's honour, unravel a marriage, spark feud. Thus, midwives learned to guard their tongues as carefully as their herbs. They carried not only the lives of mothers and infants, but the reputations of entire households. And yet, They were often unprotected. Their status was neither that of wife nor thrall, hovering in a liminal place. Some were respected, honoured for their skill, sought after in distant villages. Others were feared, accused of witchcraft when misfortune struck, shunned when too many mothers died in their care. Their work was necessary, yet their place was precarious, praised when successful, cursed when fate proved merciless. Still, the midwives endured. They were the ones who caught the slippery bodies of newborns, who tied the cords, who washed the blood, who whispered the first blessings into tiny ears. They were the ones who laid coins on the eyes of mothers who did not survive, closing lids heavy with sacrifice. They stood at the threshold where life entered, and death often lingered, neither fully of one world nor the other. Thus, the secrets of midwives were as vital as the sagas of kings. They remind us that survival was never only in the clash of steel, but in the quiet, unseen labour of women who bore the weight of generations in their hands. Without them, the Viking world would have been silent, its lineage cut short by the merciless odds of birth. When the longhouse filled with smoke, laughter, and the pounding of horns, it was not only warriors' boasts that heated the air. Viking feasts were stages where desire mingled with drink, where alliances were tested not only in words but in glances, and where the boundaries of honour strained against the weight of temptation. By firelight, men and women sat close, their shadows weaving together on the timber walls, while poets sang verses sharp as blades. Ale loosened tongues, and with loosened tongues came dangerous speech. A skald might raise his voice, crafting lines that praised a woman's beauty too boldly, or mocked a man's virility too cruelly. Such verses could ignite laughter or fury, their echoes stirring the hall long after the feast had ended. For in the Viking world, words were never harmless. Praise could honour, but it could also tempt. Mockery could amuse, but it could also shame. And in the haze of drink, both praise and mockery often slid into peril. Desire was not hidden in these moments. Men's eyes lingered on women, not their wives. Wives cast glances at men, not their husbands, and thralls moved among the benches with lowered gazes, aware that any moment could draw them into games not of their choosing. A touch too bold, a laugh held too long, could spark whispers. By dawn, those whispers might reach the ears of kin, and what began as flirtation could spiral into feud. Feasts were also where bonds of intimacy were bargained. Promises of marriage were struck over mead, concubines taken as gifts to seal alliances, daughters pledged to neighbouring chiefs. The hall was thick with more than smoke. It was thick with unspoken bargains, bodies weighed as currency in the same breath as cattle and silver. A young woman's fate could shift in a single night, her future decided not by her desire, but by the needs of her kin. Yet within this web of duty, desire still found its way. Couples slipped away into shadows, stolen moments hidden between the cracks of custom. Some found joy, brief though it was, in the press of hands beneath the furs, in whispers drowned by the roar of laughter. Others found danger, for discovery meant ruin. A feast could give birth to alliances, but it could just as easily sow seeds of scandal. The poets remembered it all. They sang of love won and lost, of husbands shamed, of wives too bold, of thralls caught in webs not their own. Their verses gave shape to the memories of feasts, ensuring that what happened in firelight lived long in the darkness of song. Thus, Viking feasts were more than celebrations. They were crucibles where desire, honour, and shame boiled together, where every glance could alter fate, and every word could strike like steel. In the clash of horns and the glow of fire, the line between joy and ruin was thin as smoke, and desire was both the sweetest and the most perilous guest at the table. For a Viking maiden, her virginity was more than flesh. It was wealth, honour, and the promise of alliance bound together in silence. Fathers guarded it as fiercely as land, for in her untouched state lay the assurance that her womb would carry no shadow of doubt. A virgin bride was a vessel of certainty, proof that her family's word was true, her children's blood untainted, her dowry worthy of its silver and cattle. Without this, the marriage bargain weakened, and whispers of shame spread like frost across the hall. Virginity was spoken of not in soft tones, but in oaths and contracts. When a man sought a wife, he bargained not only for her beauty or her dowry, but for the assurance that she was untouched. The bride price he offered was, in part, payment for purity, and the dowry given by her family served as pledge that she came without stain. In this way, her body became a ledger, its worth measured not in her own eyes, but in the judgments of men around her. The wedding night was the final proof. All knew the bride must show herself chaste, and though privacy was scarce, silence held heavy expectation. If blood was seen on the furs, the household rejoiced, honour confirmed. If none was found, whispers stirred, and the family's standing trembled. Sometimes excuses were offered. The maiden had bled earlier, or her body had concealed its sign, but excuses rarely silenced gossip, and gossip was as deadly as steel. For women, the weight was crushing. A slip, a secret union, even a rumour could undo her. If accused of impurity before marriage, her family might lose face, her dowry shrivel, her chances of alliance fade. In harsher cases, she might be cast aside entirely, her body marked as spoiled, her future reduced to concubinage or worse. The burden of proof always lay on her shoulders, and silence was her only shield. Men bore no such cost. A groom's virginity was of little concern, his past indulgences overlooked so long as his future vigour produced heirs. He could boast of conquests at the ale bench, and be praised for them, while a maiden, who strayed even once, was condemned. This double standard weighed heavily, yet it was enforced by law, by kin, and by custom, shaping the lives of women from the moment they first drew breath. And still, women endured. Some guarded their virginity as armour, their silence a shield against the probing eyes of kin. Others found cunning ways to conceal what had been lost, aided by midwives and whispered remedies. A few resisted altogether, choosing lovers despite the cost, carving their own path, even if it meant ruin. Their stories are scarce in the sagas, yet they linger in shadows, reminders that even under the heaviest burdens, some dared to defy. Thus, the price of virginity in the Viking world was never measured only in the body. It was coin, contract, and curse. It determined the fate of women, the honour of families, the strength of alliances. In it lay both the promise of life and the threat of disgrace, a fragile thread upon which the destiny of clans was hung. In the Viking world, honour was too fragile to rest on trust alone. It demanded proof, and often that proof came through the eyes of kin. When marriages faltered, when accusations of infidelity arose, when inheritance hung in the balance, it was not strangers who judged, but family fathers, brothers, sisters, uncles called to witness the truth of the flesh. Their presence was both shield and sword, protecting reputation when silence would not suffice, or cutting it apart when scandal was uncovered. The law codes show how deeply kin were bound to this role. A wife seeking divorce for cruelty or neglect was expected to declare it not in solitude, but before witnesses, often her own relatives. She stood at the threshold of the bed, then at the door of the hall, speaking the words that severed her marriage. Without kin to hear, her declaration meant nothing. Their ears made it law. In this way, private suffering was transformed into public judgment, and survival depended on the willingness of family to stand beside her. Likewise, accusations of adultery demanded witnesses. If a husband claimed his wife had strayed, he could not simply cast her aside without proof. He called kin to testify, to confirm rumours or deny them. The burden fell not only on the woman but on her entire family, for their honour was tied to hers. A daughter's reputation reflected her father's vigilance. A sister's shame weighed on her brother's. A wife's fidelity upheld her husband's standing. Thus, when one faltered, all bore the cost. This witnessing extended even to the bed itself. In some cases, the consummation of a marriage was verified by kin or trusted neighbours. The union was too important, too binding to leave hidden. A stain of blood on the furs, the cries of the bride on her first night, these were sometimes inspected, sometimes whispered about, to ensure that the bargain had been fulfilled. It was a practice both cruel and necessary, born of a world where lineage was fragile and doubt could destroy the future of clans. For the individuals caught in this web, the presence of kin was both comfort and curse. A woman declaring divorce might feel strength in her family's support, yet also shame at speaking her private wounds aloud. A man accused of weakness in bed might rely on kin to defend his name, but their silence could also condemn him. In Viking life, nothing of the flesh remained wholly private. The eyes of kin pierced every veil. And so, the household itself became court, kin the jurors, their judgment as binding as the law. What happened in silence at night became truth when spoken by witnesses at dawn. Honour was not preserved by secrecy, but by exposure, by showing the body's truth before those who shared your blood. Thus, when kin bore witness, the fate of marriages, reputations, and lineages was sealed. Their presence revealed the raw truth of Viking survival, that no life, no body, no union belonged wholly to itself. All were bound to family, all judged by kin, and in their judgment lay the weight of destiny. To outsiders, the Viking battlefield was the open field, the shield wall, the crash of axe and spear. But within the smoky confines of the longhouse, another battlefield was fought nightly, the bed. It was here that honour, endurance, and reputation were tested with the same weight as in war. For the act of flesh was never mere indulgence, it was duty, conquest, and ordeal. The sheets of wool and straw were no gentler than a shield rim, and the scars they left upon men and women were carved just as deeply. For the man, the bed demanded endurance. His body was measured not by tenderness, but by stamina, by the long hours he could persist. To falter was to risk whispers of weakness, to yield was to invite mockery. The bed was a proving ground, and every night could bring victory or defeat. A warrior who had returned triumphant from raids across the sea might still find himself shamed if his household whispered of his failures beneath the furs. No sword could defend him there. For the woman, the bed was burden. She endured not only the strain of her husband's duty, but the gaze of the household, the weight of expectation, the silence of kin who listened in the dark. Her cries could be heard, her endurance measured, her silence interpreted. To resist was peril, to refuse was scandal, to endure was necessity. Her body became shield, and offering both, demanded as proof of her loyalty, her fertility, her family's honour. In this way, she too fought each night, though her weapons were silence, resilience, and survival. The longhouse itself became the witness. Its beams groaned with the rhythm of bodies, its rafters heavy with memory. The firelight cast shadows on the walls that echoed the struggle, reminding all that intimacy was never private but public performance. Children feigned sleep, thralls bore silence, kin remembered. By dawn, what had passed in darkness was already woven into reputation, another line in the unending saga of the hall. It was no accident that sagas often compared sex to battle. Words of conquest, of victory, of endurance spilled across both. A man who triumphed in the bed was spoken of as mighty, his name honoured beside his deeds in war. A woman who bore the ordeal with silence was praised for strength, her endurance likened to the patience of earth itself. But just as in war, defeat was merciless. Whispers cut deeper than wounds, shame clung longer than scars. Thus, the bed was more than a place of rest. It was battlefield and stage, proving ground and judgment hall. Each act was weighed as heavily as any duel, each sigh measured like the clash of swords. For in the Viking world, Survival was not only the work of axe and shield, but of flesh and endurance. The bed, no less than the field, demanded warriors, and its victories and defeats echoed through households for generations. The longhouse was thick with smoke, smoke from the hearth that never died, smoke from torches guttering in the night, smoke that clung to the hair and the wool and the very skin. But in that smoke also lived the secrets of the hall. Whispers, glances, betrayals, and desires all hung in the air, hidden yet never gone. The Viking world had little privacy, but it had silence, and in that silence secrets took root. Thralls knew much, for they moved silently through the shadows, refilling horns, tending fires, clearing furs. They saw who lingered too long in another's gaze, who slipped away after feasts, who whispered soft words when they thought no ears were listening. Their silence was forced, their secrets heavy, yet their knowledge shaped the undercurrent of rumour that flowed through the hall. A master who forgot this could find his shame carried far by those he believed voiceless. Women, too, kept their own secrets. A wife might suspect her husband's infidelity, but guard her knowledge, biding her time until the right moment to strike. A concubine might bear a child in silence, hoping it would be claimed. Midwives held the deepest secrets of all, knowing whose wombs had carried life, whose had ended it, whose children bore the blood of men other than their husbands. Their lips were sealed, but their eyes remembered, and the weight of their knowledge gave them quiet power. Men carried secrets of shame, though they boasted of conquest. A warrior mocked for weakness in the bed might pretend indifference, but in his heart he feared the whispers. Others sought solace with thralls, hoping no one noticed, only to find that silence was fragile. A single careless word at a feast could reveal what had been hidden, and once spoken, secrets burned brighter than the fire in the hearth. The smoke itself seemed to guard these truths, cloaking the rafters in shadow, hiding glances in its haze. But it also carried them, seeping into every corner of the hall, so that nothing remained unknown for long. Secrets in the Viking world were never permanent. They lingered only until someone spoke, until a verse was sung, until silence broke beneath the weight of honour. And yet, secrets were also shields. They protected reputations, preserved marriages, held families together. A wife who knew her husband's failings but spoke nothing gave him the chance to keep his honour. A thrall who endured in silence allowed the household to avoid scandal. A midwife who guarded her patient's trust saved her from ruin. In this way, secrets were currency, traded and guarded, fragile but powerful. Thus, the smoke of the longhouse was more than haze. It was memory and silence, concealment and revelation. Every secret lingered there, heavy as the air, until the day it slipped into words. For in the Viking world, nothing remained hidden forever. The smoke might shield for a time, but when it cleared, the truth burned brighter than flame, reshaping honour and destiny alike. In the Viking world, the weight of lineage pressed hardest upon women, for in their bodies lay the fragile promise of heirs. A barren womb was not merely a private sorrow, it was a public burden, one that could unravel marriages, stir whispers in halls, and fracture alliances carefully built. A wife, unable to bear children, was seen as failing her duty, her silence heavy with shame, her place in the household trembling with every passing season. The wedding feast might have been grand, the bride price and dowry exchanged with honour, but if moons turned to years without a child's cry in the longhouse, questions sharpened. Was the wife cursed? Had her womb been closed by the gods? Had her family deceived the groom, giving him a bride unfit to carry his blood? Each question cut deeper than steel, for they cast doubt not only on the woman, but on her kin, who had pledged her as fertile vessel of alliance. The wife herself bore the harshest scrutiny. Every sigh, every glance, every gesture was weighed against her silence of children. Other women in the household might mock her in whispers, thralls might smirk in corners, and poets could twist her name into a verse of shame. In some halls she was pitied, in others despised. Her barrenness became more than her own. It became a stain upon the entire household, proof of failure in the eyes of neighbours and kin. Men, too, were not free of suspicion, but rarely did blame settle on their shoulders. If a household lacked heirs, tongues might suggest the husband's weakness, yet such whispers were dangerous and less often spoken. More often, the burden fell upon the wife, her body examined not with care but with accusation. If another union bore children quickly, the blame was confirmed, and the barren wife's fate grew darker. Law gave men the power to cast aside barren wives. Divorce was spoken aloud at bed and door, and the woman was sent back to her kin, her dowry sometimes withheld, her reputation bruised. Families worked quickly to remarry her, often to men of lesser standing, for her worth in alliance had diminished. Some were sent into concubinage, others faded into obscurity, their names erased from saga and memory alike. Yet not all barren women were powerless. Some turned to midwives and their secret knowledge of herbs, hoping for remedies whispered through generations. Others invoked charms, praying to Freya or laying offerings at sacred stones, begging the gods for life within their wombs. A few carved power through cunning, shaping the household with wisdom and strength that no child could provide. Though their names are rare in saga, traces of their endurance remain, proof that even barren women found ways to wield influence in a world that sought to silence them. Thus, the burden of barren wombs was more than the absence of children. It was the weight of honour, lineage, and survival pressing upon fragile flesh. In their silence, these women bore the heaviest trials of all. Their lives a reminder that in the Viking world, to be unable to create life was to live always on the edge of ruin. In the shadows of the longhouse, where the warmth of the hearth dimmed and the smoke hung low, the thralls lay. They heard what others denied, saw what others ignored, and carried the secrets of their masters like chains around their necks. Among the greatest of these burdens were the silences they bore the knowledge of the bed, of who reached for whom, of which cries came in pain and which in duty. Their voices were not asked, their truths unspoken, yet they held within them the raw undercurrent of the household's most dangerous truths. The thrall woman endured the heaviest silence. Taken without consent, used when commanded, her suffering was not recorded as crime, but accepted as the right of her master. If she bore a child, its fate was not hers to decide. It might be raised in the hall, sold into another's household, or cast out to frost and silence. She could not speak against it. Her voice was as worthless as the tools she handled. And yet, in her silence, she knew everything. She knew which wives wept in the night, which husbands failed, which sons mocked their fathers. Her silence was not ignorance, it was endurance. The thrall man also bore silence. He might be mocked, humiliated, forced into acts that stripped him of dignity. His pain was hidden, for to speak was to invite punishment harsher than endurance. Yet his silence carried weight too. He saw when masters overstepped, when kin quarrelled, when secrets of the bed became whispers of the hall. His silence became the soil in which rumours grew, for though thralls rarely spoke aloud, they remembered and others knew it. Sometimes silence was broken, though never safely. A thrall might speak under oath at a thing, forced to testify when honour demanded proof. But even then, their word was considered lesser, their truth doubted unless echoed by the free. The household might use their silence when convenient, but punish their speech when it cut too close. In this way, thralls lived at the edges of law, trapped between memory and fear. And yet, silence gave them a strange power. By saying nothing, by holding secrets unspoken, they survived. A thrall who betrayed too much might be beaten, maimed, or killed. A thrall who held silence could endure, sometimes gaining the fragile trust of masters who relied on their discretion. Within this silence, some carved small spaces of influence. a midwife thrall who kept her mistress's secrets, a servant who guarded the reputation of his master against rumour. Their silence, though forced, sometimes became currency, traded for scraps of safety. Thus, the thrall's silence was both prison and shield. It revealed the harsh truth of Viking society, that even in the most intimate moments, the unfree were present, their eyes open, their ears listening. They carried knowledge heavier than chains, but they spoke none of it. Their silence was survival, and in that silence lay the forgotten heart of the Longhouse, the truths no saga sang, but which shaped every breath of life within its smoky walls. In the Viking world, oaths were stronger than iron. A man's word bound him before gods and kin, and to break it was to shatter his honour. Yet desire often pressed harder than oaths, and when flesh overcame vow, the cost was ruin. Affairs between free men and married women were more than secret pleasures. They were betrayals that could ignite feuds, topple households, and draw blood in the name of wounded pride. The married woman carried the heaviest peril. Her fidelity was oath itself, sworn not only to her husband, but to her family, whose honour was pledged in her body. If she strayed, she endangered lineage, for doubt fell on the legitimacy of her children. Whispers began, were they truly her husband's heirs, or the sons of another? Such questions could unravel alliances carefully woven through dowry and bride price, turning kin against kin. Her lapse of desire became a wound that spread far beyond her own life. The man who lay with her bore danger as well, for he had trespassed upon another man's honour. It was no simple indulgence, it was theft, the stealing of reputation. To be discovered meant vengeance. Husbands could demand compensation in silver, yet often they demanded blood. A duel might follow, or worse, a feud stretching across generations. For to steal another's wife was to declare him weak, to mock his authority in his own hall. No warrior could allow such insult to go unanswered. Yet still, desire broke oaths. The sagas whisper of women who sought lovers in secret, of men who risked their lives for stolen embraces. Sometimes it was passion, sometimes rebellion, sometimes desperation in marriages cold as frost. Women trapped with cruel or absent husbands turned to others, seeking what duty denied them. Men, blinded by lust or pride, ignored the dangers, and in those stolen nights the foundation of honour cracked. The consequences were merciless. A woman discovered might be beaten, divorced, or even slain. A man caught could be outlawed, driven into exile, stripped of property and protection. Families feuded over spilled honour, blood answering blood until the gods alone could judge the balance. Even when not discovered, suspicion lingered, and suspicion itself was ruin enough. Once whispers began, they were never silenced. And yet, desire remained, unstoppable as the tide. It revealed the truth that beneath laws and oaths, men and women were still flesh, still vulnerable to longing. The sagas do not romanticize these moments. They show them as peril, as proof of the fragility of honour. Love was not celebrated in secrecy, but condemned in consequence, for every oath broken by desire left scars on families, kin, and reputation. Thus, when desire broke oaths, it was more than betrayal of spouse. It was betrayal of kin, of gods, of community. It revealed how thin the walls of honour truly were, how easily flesh could tear them down. And in those moments, the Viking world learned again its harshest truth, that survival rested not only on strength of arms, but on mastery of the self. When a Viking bride crossed the threshold of her husband's hall, she carried more than her dowry. Into her hands were placed keys, iron or bronze, heavy against her belt, clinking with the weight of authority. These were not mere tools for chests and storerooms. They were symbols of her place, her honour, her power. With them, she ruled the household stores, commanded servants, and stood as guardian of the hall when her husband sailed away. The wife's keys marked her as more than consort. They marked her as keeper of order, Every sound of those keys was reminder of her duty. She opened the chests of silver, measured grain for the winter, rationed mead for feasts. Nothing passed through the hall without her hand upon it. The wife knew who ate, who drank, who laboured, who lingered too long near the hearth. Her vigilance ensured survival, and her failures could mean hunger, debt, or shame. The keys clinked with every decision, and in their sound lay both respect and scrutiny. But the keys also bound her. They were gifts, yet also chains, for they reminded her constantly of what was expected. Her fidelity was tied to them. Her reputation weighed against their metal. If she was accused of unfaithfulness, whispers said she was unfit to guard the hall. If she failed in childbirth, some claimed the gods had turned against her household. The same keys that gave her authority could be stripped away in disgrace, leaving her powerless, cast aside, her belt empty. Still, a shrewd wife could wield them like weapons. While her husband boasted in the ale hall or raided abroad, she ruled the home. She managed thralls, disciplined children, received guests, and oversaw trade. In her hands lay the rhythm of daily life, and often her counsel shaped decisions in ways no sword could. Men might laugh at women's chatter, but many chiefs leaned on their wives' judgment, their authority rooted in the clinking of those iron rings. The keys also carried symbolic weight in disputes of honour. A wife's authority over the household meant that her silence or her word could decide feuds. If she testified against a husband, declaring cruelty or neglect, her statement carried the force of truth, for she bore the keys, proof of her stewardship. If she stood by him, her presence could silence suspicion. Thus, the keys were more than household tools. They were signs of law and witness, heavy with consequence. Even in burial, women carried their keys. Archaeologists find them still, laid beside bones in graves, testimony that the woman, even in death, held authority. They remind us that in the Viking world, power was not only measured in axes and swords, it clinked softly at the belt of wives, shaping survival through daily vigilance. Thus, the wife's keys revealed the paradox of Viking women, bound by duty yet wielding quiet power, guardians of honour yet judged harshly by it. Their sound echoed through every hall, a reminder that within smoke and timber, survival depended as much on the jangling of keys as on the clash of steel. In the Viking world, weakness in the bed was not simply private failing. It was shame that burned hotter than fire, shame that clung like smoke in the rafters, shame that cut deeper than steel. A man who faltered, who could not endure, who left his wife unsatisfied, bore a mark upon his honour as grave as cowardice in battle. For just as he was expected to stand firm in the shield wall, he was expected to endure beneath the furs. If he failed, whispers grew, and whispers in the Viking hall were as deadly as blades. The sagas hint at such mockery, though never kindly. A man accused of weakness was mocked as less than a man, his name twisted into verses of insult. To be called agra, unmanly, was to be branded with a wound no silver could heal. It meant that he was not only weak in body, but dishonourable in spirit, unfit to lead, unfit to guard his kin, unfit to father heirs. In such words lay destruction, for reputation was the true shield of a Viking, and once cracked it could not be mended. Wives, too, bore the burden of such weakness. A woman bound to a man who faltered, endured whispers herself. Was she barren because of him? Was she unloved, unsatisfied, or worse, tempted to stray? Neighbours judged her silence, kin pressed questions, thralls smirked in shadows. Though she had no fault, she carried his shame with her, for the household's honour was won, and failure in the bed was never contained. Sometimes men sought remedies. Charms of fertility were worn, herbs brewed into bitter drinks, prayers whispered at sacred stones. Midwives knew of such herbs, whispered from mother to daughter, meant to restore strength, to prolong endurance, to silence shame. Yet not all remedies worked. and often they served only to deepen the despair. For a man who carried this weakness could never fully escape it. His body betrayed him, and his hall remembered. Others sought to mask their shame with cruelty. They boasted louder at feasts, struck harder at home, or turned to thralls, using force where endurance failed. But such actions did not erase the truth. The walls of the longhouse remembered, the smoke carried whispers, and poets carved insults sharper than swords. Weakness, once revealed, was a stain no violence could hide. And yet, weakness was not always scorned in silence. In rare cases, a man who acknowledged his failing, who bore it with grim endurance, could preserve some measure of dignity. To admit weakness was dangerous, but to deny what all already knew was worse. Honour could not be restored, but pity sometimes replaced laughter, and pity was a softer fate than mockery. Thus, the shame of weakness was more feared than wounds, for wounds healed and became scars of valour, while weakness lingered as shadow. In the Viking world, where survival demanded strength in every act, the man who faltered in the bed carried not only his own shame, but the dishonour of all who bore his name. Within the smoky longhouse, where furs were shared and secrets lay heavy in the air, no figure was more feared than the jealous wife. She bore the keys at her belt, her authority clinking with each step, yet her honour was fragile, tested each time her husband's gaze lingered on another. Concubines, thralls, even visiting women at feasts all threatened her standing, for in their presence lay the risk of shame. A wife's jealousy was not idle feeling, it was survival, sharpened into vigilance as fierce as any warrior's blade. The sagas tell of wives who spoke boldly, their words cutting sharper than axes. A husband who flaunted his desire for another could expect no quiet acceptance. His wife might shame him at the feast, mocking his failure to honour her bed. She might refuse his touch, withholding her silence until he remembered her place. In extreme cases, she could call for divorce, declaring before kin and neighbours that she would no longer endure. Jealousy was not weakness, it was weapon, wielded to defend her household against rivals who threatened her children's inheritance. Concubines were the greatest source of strife. Though permitted by custom, their presence unsettled every wife. A concubine who bore a son stood as a shadow beside her legitimate heirs. A husband's affection for a concubine could tip the balance of power in the household, leaving the wife's authority diminished. Thus, jealousy was not mere envy, it was vigilance against threats to her lineage, her honour, and her future. A wife who ignored such dangers risked losing everything. Thralls, too, stirred jealousy. Their silence concealed much, but their bodies were often taken by masters who saw them as property. A wife might endure this if it remained hidden, but if it became known, her honour suffered. Neighbours might whisper that she was unfit, that her husband sought pleasure in slaves rather than in her. To guard against this, wives watched closely, their eyes sharp as hawks. Thralls bore the cost, enduring both the master's use and the mistress's wrath. At feasts, jealousy burned brightest. In the haze of ale, when poets sang of beauty and desire, when men boasted of their conquests, a wife's pride was tested. If her husband praised another too boldly, if he glanced too long across the benches, her fury might erupt. Some wives hurled cutting words in public, others plotted in silence, waiting to strike with shrewdness later. The hall watched, for every outburst became another layer of reputation, another tale whispered long after the fire burned out. Yet, jealousy also gave wives power. It reminded husbands that their honour depended not only on conquests abroad, but on peace at home. A jealous wife who defended her place fiercely could command respect, for she showed that she would not be diminished. Her vigilance protected her children, her keys, her legacy. Thus, the jealous wife was not figure of ridicule, but of fear and respect. Her fury could split households, ignite feuds, or preserve honour through sheer force of will. In the Viking world, jealousy was no passing storm, it was the storm that kept the longhouse whole. When a husband strayed, the wound it left in the longhouse was not hidden. Though men were permitted concubines and the use of thralls, there were still lines that could not be crossed without consequence. To betray a wife openly, to humiliate her by flaunting another woman in her place, was to strike at the very core of the household's honour. For the wife bore the keys, and her dignity upheld the household's standing. If the husband shattered that dignity, he risked not only her wrath, but the whispers of kin, the judgment of neighbours, and the anger of the gods. The betrayal of a husband was sharper than secrecy. To take another woman into the hall, to favour her before others, to show coldness to the lawful wife, these were insults no less grave than broken oaths in battle. A wife might endure her husband's wanderings if they were hidden, but open scorn could not be ignored. Her silence became heavy, her keys rattling at her belt like chains. The hall felt her anger, for every sigh, every withheld word, every tightened hand upon the chest reminded all that she had been wronged. The law, too, spoke on betrayal. While men held more freedom, they were not shielded from consequence. A wife could demand divorce if her husband failed in his duties, if he neglected her, withheld provision, or treated her with cruelty. By standing at the bed, then at the door, and finally at the gate of the hall, she could declare separation before witnesses. His betrayal thus became his own ruin, for he might lose the dowry, the bride price, and his reputation together. The wife, if strong and supported by her kin, could walk away with honour intact. Betrayal also fractured households. Children sensed the tension. Kin chose sides. Servants carried whispers beyond the walls. A favoured concubine could stir strife between siblings, her sons seen as rivals to the lawful heirs. The hall divided itself in silence, some loyal to the wife, others bending to the master's whims. In such moments, betrayal spread like fire through dry straw, consuming unity, leaving only suspicion and anger. Wives answered betrayal in many ways. Some endured in silence, biding their time, waiting for their husband's strength to wane before seizing greater control. Others struck in fury, shaming him at the feast, exposing his failings before kin. The boldest declared divorce, cutting their bonds with words that fell heavy as axes. All carried the weight of survival, for betrayal threatened not only their hearts, but their futures, their children, their very place in the world. Thus, the husband's betrayal was more than a private wound. It was a rupture in the structure of honour, a fracture that echoed through family and clan. It revealed the harsh truth of Viking life, that marriage was not only bargain but battlefield, where loyalty was demanded from both sides, and betrayal from either could destroy more than love. It could topple the hall itself, leaving only whispers in the smoke and shame carved into memory. Among the many burdens carried in Viking households, none was heavier than the birth of a child whose paternity was in question. Such a child, born of whispers and suspicion, carried with it both life and ruin. For in the Viking world, inheritance was everything, and the certainty of blood determined not only who tilled the land, but who held honour in the eyes of kin and gods. To doubt a child's father was to cast a shadow across generations. The wife bore the sharpest peril. If she conceived a child outside her husband's bed, she endangered more than herself. Her husband's lineage was threatened, his name mocked, his inheritance poisoned. A single rumour could spread like fire through the rafters, whispered at feasts, sung in mocking verses by poets eager for scandal. Even if the husband himself remained silent, the community would not. The household became a hall of suspicion, every glance at the child's face measured against the features of the supposed father. Did he resemble the husband, or another man entirely? The law offered little mercy. If adultery was proven, the wife could be divorced, stripped of her dowry, even killed in some households where honour demanded blood. The child itself stood on uncertain ground, sometimes raised in silence, sometimes abandoned, sometimes marked forever as illegitimate. Inheritance could be challenged, brothers turned against brothers, and feuds ignited as kin fought over which blood truly flowed in the child's veins. Yet not all children of shame were cast out. Some were hidden within the household, their true parentage known only to a few. A husband might choose silence, raising the child as his own to preserve the household's dignity. Others turned the child's existence into weapon, using it to shame rivals or bargain for power. A son, once grown, might carve a place for himself with sword and strength, forcing the world to acknowledge him despite his shadowed birth. For the child itself, life was precarious. Whispers followed them like shadows, mocking verse nipping at their heels. Their standing among kin was fragile, their claims to inheritance questioned at every turn. Some lived in bitterness, others in defiance, proving themselves through valor on the battlefield. A few rose to greatness, their origins forgotten as their deeds burned brighter than scandal. But many more lived quietly, their names erased, their futures dimmed by the circumstances of their birth. The sagas carry traces of these stories, often cloaked in silence. A warrior of uncertain parentage, a woman scorned for bearing the wrong man's child, a household fractured by suspicion. In each tale, the truth is the same. A child born of shame carried not only its own fate, but the fate of its kin. Thus, the child of shame revealed the fragile balance of Viking life. In a world where honor was survival, lineage certainty was shield and sword alike. To cast doubt on that lineage was to strike at the very heart of family, leaving scars deeper than wounds of war. Scars carried not only by parents, but by children born into silence, suspicion, and unending judgment. When a husband died, whether by sword, sickness, or sea, the fate of his widow was bound to the longhouse and to the judgment of kin. Her bed, once a place of duty and lineage, became a contested ground, for her body still held value as vessel of alliance. A widow's womb might yet bear children, her hands could still manage a household, her silence could still protect or ruin reputation. Thus, her life after loss was never her own. It was shaped by law, custom, and the relentless weight of survival. In some cases, the widow remained within her husband's household, bound to his kin. A brother might claim her, not as indulgence but as duty, ensuring that her children remained within the family line. This practice, known across many cultures, preserved inheritance and kept alliances intact. To refuse could mean scandal, for it suggested disdain for the dead man's honor. To accept meant surrendering choice, exchanging one husband for another. Her body pledged once more in silence. If she bore no children, her situation grew more precarious. Without heirs to secure her place, her dowry might be claimed back by her family, her presence in the hall questioned. Some widows were returned to their fathers' households, remarried quickly to strike new bargains. Others lingered in uncertainty, neither fully dismissed nor fully honoured, their keys jangling with authority, yet their position fragile. The hall watched them closely, weighing their every act, for a widow was vulnerable to both rumour and desire. Whispers often shadowed her. A widow who sought comfort in another man's arms too quickly risked shame. Her loyalty was expected, her mourning demanded, her body guarded as symbol of respect to the dead. But life in the Viking world was harsh, and survival rarely allowed for long solitude. Some remarried swiftly, forging new alliances that strengthened their kin. Others took lovers in secret, their choices hidden behind silence, for to be discovered meant ruin. The sagas speak of widows who wielded their place with cunning. Some defended their children's rights fiercely, ensuring that inheritance remained secure. Others used their authority to strengthen alliances, granting their daughters or sons in marriage to powerful families. A few claimed remarkable independence, managing farms and households in their husband's absence, their strength remembered in local memory, though rarely honoured in verse. Yet, for all their resilience, the widow's bed remained contested, her future bound to forces beyond her control. Even in burial, widows carried this burden, Archaeological finds reveal women interred with keys at their sides, reminders of authority that endured even in death. But beside them lie tokens of men, swords, tools, wealth signs that their lives were always bound to the lineage of others. Their honour was measured not by themselves, but by the families they joined, served, and bore. Thus, the widow's bed was never truly her own. It was battlefield of duty and desire, of law and survival. In her silence, she bore the weight of two households, her father's and her husband's, and her choices, whether forced or freely taken, echoed across generations like the smoke that lingered in the rafters long after the fire had died. Not all desire in the Viking world obeyed law or custom. Some unions were spoken of only in whispers, condemned by both gods and kin, yet still they happened in the shadows of longhouses or in the secrecy of distant valleys. These were the forbidden bonds connections of blood too close, of vows too sacred, of lines too sharply drawn. To cross them was to invite not only scandal but judgment, for such unions threatened the very order upon which honour and survival depended. Kinship was the firmest boundary. A man might not lie with his sister, his daughter, or his mother, for such acts were spoken of as abominations, insults to both gods and clan. The sagas condemn them, and the law codes carve harsh penalties for those accused. Yet rumours lingered that even in such households, when watchfulness failed and desire overcame, these forbidden acts took place. When discovered, they brought ruin. Families fractured, blood spilled, and the guilty were sometimes driven into exile, branded with dishonour that could not be washed away. Married women were another boundary fiercely guarded. To take a man's wife was to trespass upon his honour, to mock his household before kin and community. Such unions, when uncovered, often sparked feuds that consumed entire families. The law demanded compensation, but blood was more often the answer. A wife who strayed could be cast out, beaten, or slain. Her lover could be outlawed or challenged in duel. And yet, despite the dangers, such unions still occurred, their secrecy fragile, their consequences merciless. Unions between free women and thralls were also condemned. Though often forced upon enslaved women, when a free woman was discovered with a thrall, the scandal was sharper still. Her honour collapsed, her kin shamed, her children marked as illegitimate. To cross the line between free and unfree was to upend the hierarchy upon which the Viking world was built. Punishments were severe, ranging from divorce to exile, for such unions threatened not only honour but the very structure of society. Even within religion, boundaries stood. Some sagas whisper of women accused of lying with priests of foreign faiths, or men condemned for mocking the gods with acts considered impure. Such unions blurred lines not only of family but of faith, and in them people saw danger that reached beyond mortal law to the wrath of divine powers. The forbidden was not always born of lust. Sometimes it was rebellion, a woman resisting a cruel husband, a man defying the authority of kin. Sometimes it was love, rare and reckless, daring to exist where it was not allowed. But love was no shield in the Viking world. What mattered was not feeling but consequence, not desire but survival. Thus, forbidden unions revealed the edges of Viking law, the boundaries mortals feared to cross yet sometimes did. Their existence shows the raw truth of life in the north, that even in a world ruled by honour and order, desire was a force no law could fully contain. And when it slipped its chains, it left scars carved as deeply as any sword. When the laughter of the feast died, when the fire shrank to embers and the rafters groaned in the night, the longhouse became a chamber of silence. Yet within that silence lived the weight of everything that had been endured, the jealousies, the scandals, the burdens of wives and thralls, the shame of weakness, the danger of desire. The walls of timber remembered it all, the smoke that curled upward, carrying with it whispers of secrets that no saga would name. Men lay with pride or with shame, women with duty or with fear, thralls with silence forced upon them. Children stirred in their sleep, sensing the tension they did not yet understand. The hearth glowed faintly, its smoke heavy, as if it too bore witness. Every act, whether endured or mocked, left an echo in that stillness. For in the Viking world, intimacy was never truly private. It was carved into the fabric of honour, woven into the survival of households, carried forward in memory long after bodies slept. The silence was not peace, it was judgment. It pressed down upon those who had failed, upon those who had strayed, upon those who bore burdens they could never speak. A husband who faltered heard it in the absence of whispers. A wife who endured without complaint felt it in the still air. A thrall, lying apart in shadows, carried it as the heaviest of chains. The silence itself became a weapon, harsher than words, sharper than verse, for it told each person exactly what others dared not say aloud. Yet within the silence also lay strength. Wives who guarded their families in stillness, husbands who bore shame without breaking, thralls who survived by withholding truths all endured because of it. The long silence was survival, a shield that allowed the household to endure another day, another night, another season. In silence, scandal could be buried, honour preserved, life continued. Still, the truth remained. The silence of the Viking longhouse was never empty. It was heavy with desire unspoken, with pain unacknowledged, with secrets too dangerous to voice. It was the final curtain after every act performed in the hall, a shroud that cloaked dishonour and preserved what reputation could be saved. And when dawn came, when smoke rose again and voices returned, the silence lingered, hidden in the rafters, carried in the eyes of those who remembered. Thus ended each day in the Viking world, not with peace, but with the long silence, a silence that bore witness, that judged, that endured. A silence that was as much a part of survival as the axe, the shield, or the womb. In that silence lay the truest truth of Viking sex, that it was never private, never free, always bound to honour and shame. And when all words were spent, all bodies weary, all eyes closed, the silence remained eternal, unflinching, absolute.